Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David.
My name's Matt.
And we're making it count.
Every week.
Nice.
So, you recently did an amazing thing.
Oh, yes.
You got qualified as a teacher.
Yeah.
Woo!
So I've just done a year, much of in-classroom experience of becoming a teacher. Yes.
So,
And
yeah, you got your PGCE.
yeah, which is a postgraduate certificate of education,
And then now you're a QTS.
which is qualified teacher status.
So,
And that is one of the things I've learned from this year. Education does acronyms
Really well.
Yeah. Or badly, depending. They have a lot of acronyms, is what I'm trying to say.
I have a love affair with acronyms.
So we thought it might be quite interesting for me to reflect a little bit on what I've learned about learning this year through teaching.
Yeah. So,
I want to start. What do you think learning is?
what do I think learning is? I think learning is a process of transformation.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
So, probably a little while ago, I would have said, I think learning is acquiring new knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that true learning changes you.
Okay.
And so either in the acquiring of knowledge or the gaining a new skill, or I think it is changing. So I think learning is transformation.
Okay, interesting. So one of the things that I've heard someone say, which I thought was quite good, is learning is a change in long-term memory. And so there is that information piece to it, which is where sort of the second part of it comes, which is lots of people talk about learning facts or learning skills or who you're becoming. And ultimately, if you want to have skills, that is applied facts in some way.
Yeah.
So you have to have memorized or know inside you in your long-term memory those things.
Yes.
So when you're memorizing something, it becomes part of you, right? So it's that change.
Absolutely.
It's that change in long-term memory. That was
Yeah.
something that was quite interesting to me, because one of the things you realize is that everyone is able to perform something. I show you how to do it, you do it.
Yeah.
If I ask you in 6 weeks' time, that's whether you really learned it or
Yes.
whether you really know it.
Yeah. I like that. And obviously in the context of education, because I'm thinking one of the things I typically think when I think of learning is a skill, often like a physical skill. Like, you know, for me, one of the biggest things I've been learning the last year or so is pottery and like various different, so that's very much an embodied thing. But you know, when it comes to maths, which is what you've been teaching, they've not really necessarily had to learn any new motor skills, but there are logical, rational skills at play that they have to, this is a technique that you can use. Or for example, maybe with my work, there's whole reams of software that I don't know how to use. To use it, I don't need to know any more muscle patterns. But it's what works, how do you work with that software?
Yeah. So that's, I think, one of the key ideas about learning that I've come across this year that I'd never really twigged before, is that actually pretty much all learning is to do with memory, right? And even with pottery, that's true for you, because every session you go back, you're bringing all of the things you remember from the last sessions you've done.
Yes.
So you're not coming to it blank every time.
No.
So you obviously have remembered something and you're bringing that, and all of that past knowledge allows you to take that next step up and that next step up.
Yes.
Because it's all about memory. And so ultimately learning becomes really important. And they say, what do we remember? Well, we remember the things we think about, which are so obvious when you think about it. There's a really great line. Memory is the residue of thought.
Ooh.
So
I like that.
You remember the things you think about. And some people think we remember everything. If your brain is like a camera that it records in full HD, and if you just trigger the right memory, you can remember anything. And that thing of like, you don't remember anything about the house you grew up in for the first 5 years, but if you went back there and smelled the right smell, you could remember it. So therefore, it must be possible to trigger every memory, which is probably not true.
Yeah.
Because that would be kind of overwhelming for our senses and our experience. So from an education point of view, maybe people don't think that, but we're not very good at remembering things. We remember things of high emotion.
Yes.
We remember things that we think about. And basically they're like, if you don't think about it, your brain goes, not important. So it doesn't remember
filtered
it.
out. Yes.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I've been learning Spanish as well this year, and there are elements of you do have to repeat things. But they were saying one of the common mistakes that lots of language learners and they're looking at Spanish learners make is they think one of the best ways is just to listen to loads of Spanish, right? So they'll just stick the radio on, stick music on, have something on in the background. I said, basically what you're training your brain to do is, because if it's too far above your level, you don't understand any of it, you're basically training your brain to filter it out rather than to focus on what you do understand. So there's that whole thing of, is it just enough above your level that stretches you? But if it's too far, you kind of give up and then you go, can't do it.
Yeah. And there were some interesting things about learning that came up. Say I gave you a list of words and I said, I'm going to test you on that later. And to some other people, I said, I didn't tell them I was going to test them on it later. The groups, when tested later, didn't do any differently. So your desire to want to remember those words, because you know you're going to be tested, doesn't make a difference to whether you are capable of doing that.
Fascinating.
But the thing that did move it was, read these words, is that a pleasant or an unpleasant word for you?
Oh.
So in giving it a pleasantness, unpleasantness, basically you're giving it meaning.
Did
that hinges it to other things.
Did it matter whether it was? Did they remember pleasant ones more or less, or was it just that they've now associated it with an emotion?
Yeah, a kind of an emotion, but more that the emotion leads to a memory or a thought or an attachment to something else.
But it didn't matter whether it was positive or negative.
No.
Wow.
Yeah, so a lot then of trying to remember things and learn from them is in fact giving it meaning.
So maybe if you kind of like at the end of a hard maths lesson, you go, so how does this guy, how does this make you feel like bad about, like, yeah, so more likely to remember it maybe.
Maybe. I think it's about trying to give the learning meaning rather than just like, I remember that really miserable maths lesson. Many of us have had that. Yeah, so that's quite a lot of things that's quite interesting about learning, is that it's maybe not necessarily what we think it is, and it doesn't necessarily happen how we think it should happen.
Yeah. I suppose in your journey of becoming a qualified teacher, and I suppose you're still early on your journey of what it looks like to be a good teacher, but what was an idea about learning that has been challenged for you?
Maybe I'll ask you a different thing. One of the challenging things I found about it is there's this whole idea about cognitive load, which is that you can think about like 7 things at one time in your sort of thinking memory.
Yes.
Not your long-term memory, your like the bit you're thinking about. But actually you can think about basically 2 complex ideas.
Right.
To bring them together in your head.
The more complex, bunch a few small, simple things into a complex.
Yeah, it's that idea. We've all done it. Here's a tray of like 30 items. How many can you remember? Most people, it's about 7 to 12. Right. But they're really basic things. That's scissors and string and sellotape and all this sort of stuff. But if you make any sort of complexities to the idea, the amount decreases.
Right.
So one of the theories of education then is, well, we want to make it really simple so that they can focus on the important bit. But I went too far that way and I made it too simple that they didn't have to think about it anymore, because they could just follow it. They never actually activated it, and so they never thought about it, so they didn't get it. So you have to make it appropriately easy that they can have success, but difficult that it creates like friction going in, so they have to think about it, so that then it becomes a memory, so that they can pull it out when they need it.
Yes.
And that, I think, is basically the art of teaching, because you're not doing that in a 1-to-1 setting, you're doing that in a 1-to-30 setting,
in that
where
regard,
that point is different for every student, potentially, even if you set them.
Yeah, because if it's too easy, if each step is kind of like, oh, that's obvious, well, that's obvious, but that's obvious, the brain is almost fooled into this, I can do the whole chain, without realizing that you've been guided through that chain, you haven't chosen each one. And so then that's that sort of difficult, like how do you make it such that it's difficult enough that the brain goes, oh, well, I'm going to have to engage here to make this stick.
Yeah. So basically, the thing I've learned about learning could probably be summed up in, what are you thinking about? So you're guiding attention, you're creating thinking about the right things. And there's a whole range of tools that you use to try and do that. So you might sometimes do the self-explanation thing, where it's like, I've just done this example on the board for you, try and explain each step to yourself. So now they have to try and explain why that works. Or, you do cold calling. So, hey, Fred, why do you think this is this? So it means that everyone knows that they could be asked to answer this question. And so you're basically trying to guide thinking. And that's what learning is, right? Many of us stop learning But when you read a book, what does it do? It guides your thinking.
Yes.
When you listen to a podcast, it's guiding your thinking. When you're having an interesting conversation with somebody, it's guiding your thinking. And what do we remember? We remember the things we think about.
And that's why story is so powerful. And of course, we are a culture that is, in the sense, both absolutely replete with story and maybe also with a little bit of a poverty of storytellers. And we've talked about that before. But story carries so much in it, and it sticks with us for a long time. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a powerful way of teaching, of learning, but also of transforming people's opinions and beliefs.
Yeah, and I know we're coming up to 11 minutes, but you mentioned story. I've been reading a book on education that talks about story, and it says it basically has cognitive priority in our brains. So when we hear story, we tune in. When you compare bits of writing, we tune into the story and remember it. So it's these like bite-sized bits. Well, what's more interesting is story becomes worse when it's explained.
Yes.
So people like the unwritten or the unspoken bit of a story, and that leads to the thought, that leads to the sort of the intuition of it.
That reminds me, there was a study that I read about, or you told me about ages ago, that basically they split an audience into two, and one half of the audience, they didn't show them the last 15 or 20 minutes of the film. And immediately afterwards, they polled them and was like, so how did you enjoy this and everything? And of course, the people that finished the film rated it as a higher, more enjoyable experience. But then they did it a week and maybe 2 weeks later and again. And the people that had watched the whole film had kind of ceased thinking about it. But the people that hadn't had been thinking about it loads and had rated it even more enjoyable. And there's that element of mystery. They've been kept on the hook and their brains have been going, well, how could that story have ended? And of course, there are millions of ways that story could have ended. So
that's really nice. I have to think now how I can bring story elements to a maths lesson, which might be one of my greatest challenges yet.
Until next time.